The chains around Lavvice Vindica's wrists did not need to be strong. They only needed to be humiliating. He stood in the center of the obsidian court, blood from 100 battles still drying on his coat, and he watched his own father refuse to look at him. 12 judges sat above him in black thrones carved from the bones of the first demons. Not one of them had lifted a finger against the Hilt Clan while it slaughtered its way through 3 border villages. Not one of them had dared. Only Lavvice had walked into that clan's stronghold and ended it, root and branch, in a single night. Now they called that a crime. Banbei, the cruelest of the Black Thrones, rose first. He smiled the way a butcher smiles at a lamb that already knows its fate. He told the court that a prince who slaughters without permission is no different from the monster he claims to hunt. Lavvice wanted to laugh. The Hilt Clan had been feeding on human children for decades, hiding it behind old bloodline privilege, and this court had known. Everyone in that room had known. He told them plainly that no one else had the will to stop it. His voice did not shake. He said the Hilt Clan chose its own ending the moment it decided innocent lives were currency. Gamadare, his father and the Demon King himself, said nothing in his defense. That silence hurt worse than any blade. A king who stayed quiet while his own son begged to be understood was making a choice, and Lavvice understood exactly what that choice meant. Banbei stepped down from his throne, crossed the marble floor, and pressed a burning hand against the side of Lavvice's face. The smell of scorched skin filled the court. Nobody objected. That scar would follow him into whatever life came next, a brand marking him as convicted rather than vindicated. The sentence came fast after that. Exile, human body, sealed power. No mercy attached to any of it. Only one person in that entire court looked genuinely troubled. Lavvice Vindica, his uncle, stood near the back with his jaw tight and his hands curled into fists he never used. He did not speak against the ruling either, but his eyes told a different story than everyone else's silence. He believed his nephew. He simply had no throne to stand on. Later, in the holding chamber before the transfer ritual began, someone else believed him too. A demon Lavvice had known for years, someone who owed him a debt from an old battlefield rescue, slipped into the chamber under the excuse of preparing the restriction stone. Instead of the seal meant to crush his power into nothing, that demon implanted something else entirely, a bloodstone, small, dark, nearly invisible beneath the skin. It would not undo the exile, but it would leave a crack in the wall they were building around him, a crack that could widen if the right pressure ever came. Nobody explained why they were doing this. They just did it, quietly, the way people do things when speaking the truth out loud would get them both killed. Then the world folded around Lavvice like paper being crushed into a fist, and he woke up somewhere else entirely. He opened his eyes to a cracked ceiling stained yellow from years of leaking water. His body ached in ways his true body never had, small human aches, hunger and cold, and a headache pounding behind his eyes. He sat up and caught his reflection in a cracked mirror across the room. A teenage boy stared back, thin, bruised along one cheekbone, eyes that did not look like they belonged to someone who had ever won a fight in his life. This was Miho. Or rather, this was Miho's body, now carrying someone else entirely behind the eyes. Lavvice searched through fragments of memory that did not belong to him, and what he found there made something cold settle in his chest. Miho had been extorted for lunch money since he was 12. Miho had been shoved into lockers, had his homework torn apart in front of the class, had learned to apologize for existing before he learned much else. His mother worked 2 jobs and barely noticed the bruises. His younger sister noticed everything and cried about it where nobody could hear her. A demon prince who had once burned down a criminal clan in a single night was now trapped inside a body that flinched at raised voices. He almost laughed at the irony of it. Then he stood up, and his knees nearly buckled from a weakness he had never once experienced in centuries of life, and the laugh died somewhere in his throat. School started that same week, and Lavvice went, mostly because staying home meant facing Miho's mother and her tired, hopeful questions about a son she barely recognized anymore. The first person to speak to him kindly was a girl named Shiion. She sat 2 rows over, and on his first day back she slid a spare pencil across his desk, without being asked, murmuring something about how he looked like he'd forgotten his again. Small kindness. The kind of thing that costs nothing and means everything to someone who has never received it. Lavvice studied her the way he studied everything new, cataloging her mannerisms, the way she chewed the end of her sleeve when nervous, the way her eyes kept darting toward the door, like she was always half expecting trouble to walk through it. Trouble walked through it during lunch. 3 boys who used to own Miho's lunch money like a monthly subscription found their usual table and discovered their usual victim wasn't cooperating anymore. The leader, a broad kid named Do-yoon who had never lost a fight in that school, grabbed the front of Miho's shirt and demanded payment, with the casual confidence of someone repeating a routine he'd performed 100 times. Lavvice looked at the hand on his collar. He looked at Do-yoon's face, twisted into the practiced sneer of someone who had never once considered the possibility of consequences. Then he broke 2 of Do-yoon's fingers so fast that half the cafeteria didn't register what happened until Do-yoon was already screaming. The other 2 backed away immediately, but Lavvice didn't let them retreat that easily. He grabbed the nearest one by the collar, and for one instant, something flickered beneath his skin, a heat that didn't belong to a human body at all. Faint, almost nothing. But he felt it, a whisper of the power that was supposed to be sealed away completely. He filed that sensation away for later and finished putting all 3 boys on the ground without breaking a sweat, though his human ribs ached fiercely by the time he was done. The cafeteria went dead silent. Then it exploded into whispers. By the end of the day, half the school had heard some version of the story, most of them wildly exaggerated, and Miho, the boy who used to apologize for breathing too loudly, had become the center of a rumor nobody could quite believe. Shiion found him after school, sitting on the low wall outside the gate, and she didn't ask about the fight directly. She just handed him a can of something cold from the vending machine and sat down beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. She admitted, quietly, that she used to wish she had the nerve to stand up to people the way he just had. She said it like a confession, like something she'd never said out loud before. Lavvice, who had spent centuries surrounded by demons who respected only strength and bloodline, found himself unexpectedly moved by a human girl handing him a warm soda and telling him something true about herself, for no reason except that she trusted him. That night, lying on Miho's thin mattress, he pressed 2 fingers against his own sternum and tried to summon even a fraction of his old power on purpose. Nothing came. Whatever had flickered during the fight hadn't been something he controlled. It answered violence, not intention. Anger, not will. He didn't sleep much. Centuries of instinct told him something important was hiding just beneath the surface, and he intended to find out exactly what it was. The bullies came back 4 days later, except this time they brought reinforcements from an older grade. 6 of them total, cornering him in the alley behind the gymnasium where the school's cameras conveniently didn't reach. Do-yoon, one hand still wrapped in a splint, stood near the back this time, unwilling to get close again. The others weren't so cautious. The biggest of them threw the first punch, and Lavvice let it land, just to feel how much a full human hit actually cost his body. It cost quite a lot. Pain bloomed white and sharp across his jaw, and for a moment, he genuinely wondered if this fragile human shell would simply shatter under the weight of what he was about to do. Then that same heat stirred beneath his skin again, stronger this time, curling up through his chest like something waking from a long sleep. His vision sharpened. His reflexes, already inhumanly fast for Miho's untrained body, sped up further, and for 3 full seconds, the world moved like syrup around him while he moved through it at his own pace. He put all 6 of them on the ground. Some of them stayed down longer than others. One of them would need a hospital visit. Afterward, alone, breathing hard and bleeding from a split lip, Lavvice noticed something strange. The pain in his body faded faster than it should have. Faint lines of dark energy, barely visible, traced briefly along his forearm before sinking back beneath the skin. He didn't understand the mechanism yet, but he understood the pattern. Violence around him, aimed at him or done by him, cracked open something the exile was supposed to have sealed shut forever. Word of the second beating spread even faster than the first. By the following week, nobody at that school looked at Miho the way they used to. Some feared him outright. A few, oddly, began treating him with something close to admiration. The social order that had crushed Miho for years reversed itself in the space of 2 fights, and Lavvice found the whole spectacle almost darkly amusing. Humans built entire hierarchies out of who was willing to throw the first punch. He kept his focus elsewhere, though. Somewhere in the demon realm, someone he trusted had risked everything to give him a crack in his own prison. He didn't intend to waste it sitting around a classroom pretending to care about algebra. Shiion, meanwhile, had begun acting strange in ways that had nothing to do with him. She'd disappear during lunch some days, phone gripped tight, expression tense in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of Miho's old fear. Once, he caught the edge of a conversation through her phone speaker, a low male voice giving instructions rather than making requests, and Shion's shoulders curling inward the way someone's do when they've learned that saying no costs more than staying quiet. He didn't push her about it yet. He recognized the shape of that fear too well, though on her it looked different than it had on Miho. Miho's fear had been about survival. Whatever gripped Shion felt more like obligation, like a debt she couldn't see the bottom of. The real turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday, when a girl in the year below them collapsed in the hallway outside the science labs. Lavvice was close enough to smell it before anyone else noticed anything wrong. A faint, wrong scent, sweet and rotten underneath, the kind of smell he associated with corrupted magic rather than human illness. He crouched beside her while a teacher shouted for the nurse, and his eyes caught something on the inside of her wrist as her sleeve slipped back. A symbol, small, faded, but unmistakable to him. The Hilt Clan crest. For a moment his human heart, still adjusting to its new rhythm, actually skipped a beat. He had ended that clan personally, watched the last of its bloodline fall. There should be nothing left of them anywhere, let alone branded onto the arm of an ordinary human student, in a world the Hilt Clan had never even known existed. The girl was rushed to the hospital, and Lavvice, using an excuse about being a concerned classmate that nobody bothered questioning given his newfound reputation, followed close behind. What he learned in that hospital corridor unsettled him more than Exile itself had. A nurse, tired and talking more than she probably should have to a random teenager, mentioned that this wasn't the first collapse they'd seen with that same strange mark. Most of the affected kids had one thing in common. They'd all recently gotten new tattoos from a shop 2 streets over from the school, run by a man everyone in that part of town called Jingi. Lavvice filed the name away with the same cold focus he once reserved for enemy commanders on a battlefield. He found the tattoo parlor 3 days later, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered convenience store, its windows covered in flyers advertising something called Blue Bow. Diet supplement, the flyers claimed. Energy boost. Confidence in a bottle. The scent hit him before he even opened the door. That same rotten sweetness, stronger here, soaked into the walls like the building itself had been marinating in it for months. Jingi turned out to be a lean man in his 30s, with cold eyes and a voice that never quite matched the friendliness of his words. He looked Lavvice up and down, clocked him instantly as the student who'd apparently put half a grade's worth of bullies in the hospital, and decided, wrongly, that this made him worth recruiting rather than worth fearing. He offered Lavvice a sample, told him Blue Bow could make someone stronger, sharper, unstoppable, the kind of pitch clearly rehearsed on dozens of desperate teenagers before him. Lavvice declined, calmly, and instead asked where the tattoos came from. Jingi's friendly mask slipped for just a second, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous underneath. He said some questions weren't good for a person's health. Lavvice smiled at that. It wasn't a kind smile. He left the parlor without further incident, mostly because Jingi had 2 armed men in the back room and enough sense not to start something in broad daylight. But Lavvice had gotten what he needed. He'd confirmed the scent, confirmed the connection between the crest, the tattoos, and whatever Blue Bow actually was underneath its marketing. That night, back in Miho's cramped bedroom, he pressed his palm flat against the wall and let a thin thread of demonic energy leak out, testing his range, now that his power had grown slightly stronger from repeated exposure. One of the animal observers his father's court had likely planted somewhere in this world would sense it eventually. He was counting on it. 2 nights later, a stray cat appeared on his windowsill, sitting far too still, watching him with eyes that held far too much intelligence for an ordinary animal. Lavvice studied it for a long moment before speaking directly to it, asking who had sent it and why they were bothering to watch a disgraced exile at all. The cat's posture shifted, subtly, into something less feline and more deliberate. A voice emerged from it, quiet and clearly amused, a young woman's voice that introduced herself only as a lesser demon assigned to distant observation duty. She admitted, with surprising honesty, that she'd been sent to report on his condition, and that she'd expected to find someone broken and pathetic rather than someone already tearing apart a criminal operation 3 weeks into exile. Lavvice asked her name. She hesitated, then admitted she didn't really have one worth using. Lesser demons rarely did. He gave her one on the spot, almost carelessly, the way someone names a stray they've decided to keep. Street, because that's where he'd first sensed her presence, trailing him along the sidewalks near the tattoo shop. She seemed startled by the gesture, more than the situation warranted. It became clear, over the following days, that nobody had ever bothered giving her anything at all, let alone a name spoken like it meant something. Street became useful almost immediately. She had access to information channels Lavvice couldn't reach on his own. Whispers moving through the lesser demon network about strange energy readings coming from human world warehouses, about a name surfacing more and more often in connection with Blue Bow's distribution, Young Mu. She warned him, in her own dry way, that whoever Young Mu actually was, the lesser demons who'd tried investigating him directly had a habit of simply stopping their reports without explanation. Lavvice took that warning the way he took most warnings, as a reason to move forward rather than a reason to stop. He and Street began mapping the Blue Bow supply chain together over the following 2 weeks, tracing shipments from Jingi's parlor back through a series of increasingly careful cutouts, false fronts, and midnight transfers. Street proved sharper than her cautious personality suggested, spotting patterns in shipment timing that Lavvice, still relearning how modern human logistics functioned, would have missed entirely. Their search eventually led them to an abandoned industrial district on the edge of the city. 3 warehouses connected by a private loading yard, guarded more heavily than any legitimate diet supplement business had any reason to be guarded. Lavvice pressed his palm against the outer wall of the nearest warehouse and felt something that made even his centuries of battlefield experience go quiet with unease. The corruption inside wasn't just Blue Bow product waiting for distribution. It was concentrated, thick, layered in a way that suggested something living, or something that used to be living, packed in there in staggering quantities. Devouring flowers. He recognized the signature now, the same forbidden parasitic bloom his own father's court had declared extinct centuries ago, back when the Hilt Clan still held power and secretly cultivated the very creatures everyone assumed had been wiped out entirely. The pieces clicked together with a coldness that settled deep in his chest. The clan he had destroyed hadn't been fully destroyed at all. Somewhere, someone had preserved its darkest research, carried it into the human world, and built an entire criminal empire on top of it. Street felt it too, her borrowed cat body going rigid beside him, and she suggested, quietly, that whatever was inside those warehouses was well beyond anything 2 of them should approach without backup they didn't currently have. Lavvice ignored that advice completely, because a shadow had just detached itself from the loading dock and started walking directly toward them, and the shadow belonged to Jingi, flanked by 6 men whose eyes carried the same unnatural sharpness Lavvice had first noticed in the Blue Bow-strengthened gang members near the school. Jingi didn't bother pretending to be friendly this time. He told Lavvice that curious children who wandered somewhere this deep didn't always find their way back home. Behind him, one by one, his men began swallowing small blue capsules pulled from their pockets, and the air around the loading yard thickened instantly with that same rotten sweet corruption Lavvice had first smelled in the tattoo parlor, except now, it was pouring directly into human bloodstreams in real time. The first man to reach him moved faster than any human body should allow, faster even than the enhanced gang members from the school fight. Lavvice sidestepped a punch that cratered the concrete where he'd been standing, and drove his elbow into the man's ribs hard enough to hear something crack beneath the layer of demonic strength wrapped around him. It didn't stop him. Blue Bow didn't just add speed and power, Lavvice realized in that instant. It dulled pain, buried instinct beneath something closer to compulsion. The man kept coming, even with broken ribs, swinging wildly, eyes glassy and unfocused. Street's voice crackled through the small earpiece she'd rigged for him days earlier, tense and urgent, warning him that the corruption pouring off these men was climbing fast, faster than she'd ever tracked in a live reading before. Lavvice barely needed the warning. He could feel it himself, thick and rotten in the air, clinging to his skin like smoke. And beneath the discomfort, something else stirred, something eager. The same heat that had answered violence back at school was answering now too, except this time it wasn't a flicker. It was a current, rising steadily the longer he stood inside all that concentrated darkness. He broke the second attacker's wrist before the man even landed a hit. The third came at him with a length of pipe, and Lavvice caught it mid-swing with one hand, the metal groaning under a grip that shouldn't have belonged to a scrawny high schooler. Jingi stayed back near the loading dock, watching with an expression sliding slowly from confidence into something closer to disbelief. He'd expected 6 enhanced men to be more than enough for one overconfident teenager. Instead, his men were dropping one after another, and each fall seemed to feed whatever was happening to their opponent instead of weakening him. By the time the 4th man went down, Lavvice's eyes had shifted, faintly, to a shade of red that had nothing human left in it. Small cracks of dark energy traced along his knuckles, visible now instead of hidden beneath the skin, and his exhaustion, the bone-deep fragility that usually plagued Miho's untrained body, had simply vanished. The 5th and 6th men hesitated, and hesitation against someone moving at that speed was as good as surrender. Lavvice ended it quickly after that, leaving all 6 sprawled across the loading yard in various states of consciousness, none of them capable of standing back up anytime soon. He turned toward Jingi last, walking with unhurried steps that somehow felt more threatening than a full sprint would have. Jingi backed against the warehouse door, hands raised, all his earlier menace gone. He asked, voice cracking slightly, what exactly Lavvice was, because no ordinary human walked away from a blue bow overdose looking stronger than when he started. Lavvice didn't answer the question directly. He simply told Jingi that whoever supplied him with these tattoos and this drug had made a serious miscalculation, and that miscalculation was about to become someone's very personal problem. He let Jingi run. Not out of mercy, but because a frightened man talking to his superiors was more useful right now than a dead one. Street, still watching from a safe distance, pointed out dryly that letting the enemy escape wasn't standard tactical procedure, and Lavvice replied that patience often worked better than a blade when you wanted to see where the real rot was hiding. He kept Jingi's dropped phone. That single object would matter more than anything else he found in that warehouse that night. Meanwhile, several miles across the city, inside a theater with red velvet seats and gold trim on every railing, a girl named Yura stood in the wings preparing for the performance that was supposed to define her career. She was 17, and she had trained since she was 5 years old, and for the past 4 months her mother had been slipping small blue capsules into her water bottle before every rehearsal. Yura's mother believed, sincerely, that the sudden improvement in her daughter's stamina and flexibility came from a new supplement recommended by a trusted instructor. She had no idea the instructor answered to someone else entirely. Yura herself had started noticing strange things a few weeks back. Numbness in her fingertips after long rehearsals, a ringing in her ears that came and went without warning. She'd mentioned it once to her mother, who dismissed it as ordinary performance stress, the kind every dancer experienced before a big show. Backstage, an older man in an expensive coat watched the preparations from a shadowed corner, arms folded, expression unreadable. This was young Mu. Though nobody in that theater knew his real involvement in anything beyond a generous private sponsorship of the ballet company. He watched Yura stretch her legs with mechanical precision and said nothing, betraying no concern at all for the girl whose body he had been quietly poisoning for months. The performance began beautifully. Yura moved across the stage with a lightness that drew gasps from the audience, spins tighter and holds longer than anything she'd managed in rehearsal. Her mother wept quietly in the 3rd row, certain she was watching her daughter's talent finally blossom into something extraordinary. Halfway through the 2nd act, Yura's leg buckled mid-turn. She caught herself, barely, and the audience assumed it was part of the choreography, a dramatic stumble meant to convey emotion. Then her other leg gave out too, and this time there was no catching it. She collapsed center stage, body convulsing slightly, foam gathering faintly at the corner of her mouth, while the orchestra faltered into silence, and the audience rose in a wave of confused, horrified murmurs. Her mother's scream cut through the theater louder than anything the orchestra had played all night. Young Mu didn't move from his shadowed corner. He simply watched paramedics rush the stage, watched Yura's small body get lifted onto a stretcher, and turned to leave through a side exit before anyone thought to question his presence at all. Later, in a private meeting far from the theater, young Mu explained the situation to one of his lieutenants, with the same flat calm he'd shown watching Yura collapse. He said Blue Bow always demanded its cost eventually. The body could only borrow strength it hadn't earned for so long before the debt came due. He called it an unfortunate but expected outcome, the way an accountant might describe an overdue invoice rather than a teenage girl's ruined future. He didn't seem worried about consequences. He seemed, if anything, mildly annoyed at the inconvenience of a public collapse. Lavvice learned about Yura's collapse 2 days later through Street, who'd picked up the story circulating through local news outlets, framed carefully as a mysterious medical episode rather than anything involving illegal substances. He recognized the pattern immediately. Another victim of the same rot he'd traced from a hospital hallway to a tattoo parlor to a warehouse full of forbidden corruption. He decided the investigation phase was over. He powered on Jingi's confiscated phone, scrolled through a contact list until he found an entry labeled simply "Boss," and sent a single message. He told whoever answered that their warehouse, their tattoos, and their drug had cost him valuable time, and that time was something he intended to be repaid for personally. The reply came faster than he expected, and it wasn't threatening or evasive the way Jingi's messages had been. It was almost polite, inviting him to a location downtown that evening, phrased like an actual business meeting rather than a criminal confrontation. Street argued against going. She pointed out, with the blunt honesty that had quickly become one of her most useful traits, that anyone confident enough to invite a stranger who'd just wrecked 6 enhanced enforcers probably had good reason for that confidence. Lavvice went anyway. Centuries of instinct told him hesitation now would only let the rot spread further before he understood its full shape. The meeting location turned out to be another warehouse, smaller than the first, positioned near the docks where shipping containers stacked in uneven towers cast long shadows under sodium lights. Young Mu stood alone in the center of the open floor when Lavvice arrived, hands clasped behind his back, expression calm in a way that felt deliberately unsettling. He greeted Lavvice by name, Miho's name, which meant he'd done research rather than relying purely on Jingi's panic description. He said he found it interesting that a high school student had single-handedly dismantled part of an operation that had survived 3 separate attempts by rival organizations to take it down. Lavvice asked him directly about the devouring flowers, about the Hilt Clan crest, about whether young Mu understood exactly what kind of corruption he was cultivating in those warehouses. Something shifted behind young Mu's eyes at the mention of the crest. Small, but unmistakable, he said carefully. That some inheritances came with more baggage than people expected, and that he'd learned to work with what he was given, rather than question its origins too deeply. That answer told Lavvice everything he needed to know. Young Mu wasn't just a criminal exploiting a strange drug. He was connected, somehow, to whatever remained of the Hilt Clan's legacy, whether he fully understood that connection or not. Young Mu's posture shifted then, subtle but deliberate, and the air around him thickened, with the same rotten-sweet corruption Lavvice had smelled at the first warehouse. Except this time, it wasn't coming from a blue bow capsule. It was coming from young Mu himself. He wasn't an ordinary human. That much became instantly clear. He moved first, closing the distance between them faster than his relaxed posture suggested was possible, and the first exchange of blows rattled through the warehouse like thunder trapped in a metal box. Lavvice blocked, absorbed, countered, and found himself genuinely surprised for the first time since arriving in this world. Young Mu hit like something trained specifically to counter demonic strength, each block precise, each counterattack aimed at joints and pressure points a purely human fighter would never think to target. Lavvice asked, between exchanges, exactly what young Mu was, since he clearly wasn't simply human, and clearly wasn't simply demon either. Young Mu didn't answer directly. He said only that labels mattered less than results, and drove a kick into Lavvice's ribs that sent him sliding backward across the concrete floor, human bones screaming in protest at the impact. Pain flared white and sharp through his chest, and for a moment, Lavvice genuinely worried Miho's fragile body might not survive this confrontation at all. Then his gaze fell on a cracked container nearby, its contents spilled across the floor in a shattered blue puddle of concentrated blue bow essence, corruption radiating off it in thick, visible waves. He remembered the loading yard. He remembered how that concentrated darkness had answered him instead of resisting him. He pushed himself upright and walked directly into the spill. The effect hit immediately, corruption flooding into him through every point of contact, and this time it wasn't a slow current rising beneath his skin. It was a flood, violent and overwhelming, and for one terrifying second, Lavvice worried it might simply tear Miho's body apart from the inside. Then something in him adjusted, some instinct carried over from centuries of controlling, far greater power than this, and the flood settled into something usable, instead of something destructive. His eyes burned fully red now, dark energy wrapped visibly around both forearms, curling like smoke given shape and purpose. When he moved again, young Mu's confident expression finally cracked into something closer to alarm. The second exchange went very differently from the first. Lavvice's strikes landed harder, faster, each one carrying weight that shouldn't have belonged to a body this small and human. Young Mu's carefully trained counters, precise against ordinary demonic strength, started failing against something that no longer fit neatly into his expectations. Young Mu fought harder than anyone Lavvice had faced since arriving in this world, throwing techniques that mixed human martial precision with something older and stranger underneath. But the concentrated corruption feeding Lavvice's borrowed power kept climbing, kept tipping the fight further in one direction. The final exchange ended with young Mu on his knees, one arm hanging useless at his side, blood running from a cut above his eye, staring up at a teenage body radiating power that made absolutely no logical sense to him. Lavvice stood over him, fist raised, every instinct from centuries as an executioner, screaming at him to finish this exactly the way he'd finished the Hilt Clan. Then the exile's rule surfaced in his mind, cold and absolute. He could not kill a human. Breaking that rule wouldn't just cost him this borrowed body. It would destroy his soul completely, permanently, beyond any chance of ever reclaiming what he'd lost. His fist stopped inches from young Mu's face, and the fury draining out of him left behind something closer to frustration than restraint. He lowered his arm instead, breathing hard, corruption still curling faintly around his knuckles as it slowly faded back beneath his skin. Young Mu, badly beaten but very much alive, watched him with an expression that had shifted from alarm into something more calculating, like a man recalculating an equation he'd gotten badly wrong the first time. He told Lavvice, voice rough but steady despite his injuries, that he'd clearly underestimated him and that mistakes like that tended not to happen twice. Lavvice turned and walked away without answering, leaving young Mu kneeling alone among shattered containers and spilled corruption, because there was nothing left to say to a man he couldn't legally finish and wouldn't legally forget. While Lavvice fought inside that warehouse, several miles away, Shiion sat alone in her bedroom in front of a laptop screen, hands shaking as she stared at lines of code she'd written herself, code that powered an application called I'm Here. The app had started as something innocent, a school project meant to help students report bullying anonymously. Somewhere along the way, young Mu's organization had gotten involved, twisted its purpose entirely, turned it into a tool for tracking Blue Bow users and pressuring them into compliance whenever they tried to stop using. Shiion hadn't built it for that. She hadn't known, not fully, until it was already too late to walk away without consequences. She'd carried that guilt quietly for weeks, smiling at Miho in class, pretending everything was fine, while a part of her felt more trapped every single day. That night, watching news coverage of Yura's collapse loop endlessly across her phone screen, something in her finally broke free of whatever fear had kept her compliant for so long. She opened her laptop, connected to the servers her own code still had backdoor access to, and began systematically crashing every system connected to that application. Her hands moved fast, desperate. Years of careful programming knowledge turned suddenly against the very thing she'd built. Her own phone buzzed constantly with warnings, then threats, then a voice call from a number she recognized instantly as one of Jingi's men, low and furious, demanding she stop immediately. She didn't stop. She deleted user databases first, then core server files, working through waves of fear that made her fingers tremble against the keyboard. 2 men arrived at her apartment building 20 minutes later. She heard the front door of the building buzz open downstairs, heard heavy footsteps on the stairwell, and kept typing anyway, because stopping now meant everything she'd already destroyed had been for nothing. They broke into her apartment before she finished the final deletion sequence. One of them grabbed her by the hair, yanked her away from the laptop, and struck her hard enough across the face to split her lip. She fell against her desk, vision swimming, and reached blindly for the keyboard one last time, fingers finding the final command through sheer muscle memory alone. The deletion completed just as the second man raised his hand to hit her again. Every server connected to I'm Here went dark permanently in that exact moment. Years of collected data, tracking information, and leverage over dozens of trapped users erased beyond any hope of recovery. The men, realizing what she'd finished, dragged her out of the apartment anyway, furious and unwilling to simply let the damage go unanswered, leaving her bedroom in disarray and her phone shattered on the floor beside an empty chair. Lavvice found out something was wrong before Street even finished explaining it to him. He'd gone looking for Shiion the next morning, intending to ask her something small and unimportant, maybe about a school assignment, mostly just wanting to see a familiar face after a night spent fighting something that had nearly killed Miho's fragile body twice over. Her seat sat empty when homeroom started. It stayed empty through second period too, which wasn't unusual on its own, except her phone, when he tried calling during the lunch break, rang through to nothing at all. Disconnected, Street's voice crackled through his earpiece before he'd even left the classroom, tense in a way he hadn't heard from her before. She told him she'd picked up chatter through the Lesser Demon Network, secondhand and unconfirmed, about a girl matching Shiion's description being taken from an apartment near the Eastern District sometime after midnight. Something in Lavvice went very still and very cold. He left school without bothering to sign out, walking fast enough that the fragile human legs beneath him ached by the time he reached the Eastern District 20 minutes later. Street guided him the rest of the way, tracking faint traces of the same corrupted energy signature that clung to everything connected to Young Moo's operation. A trail leading to a squat concrete building 3 blocks from the docks, windows painted black from the inside. He didn't knock. The door came off its hinges under a single kick, and the 2 men inside, the same ones who dragged Shiion out of her apartment the night before, barely had time to reach for anything before Lavvice closed the distance between them. He didn't hold back the way he had during the school fights. There was no audience here to worry about, no reputation to manage, only a girl chained to a metal chair in the corner with a split lip and eyes gone hollow from a night spent terrified. The larger of the 2 men went down first, a single strike breaking his jaw before he finished turning around. The second reached for something at his belt, a weapon Lavvice didn't bother identifying before closing the distance and ending the threat with brutal economical efficiency. Neither man got back up. Shiion flinched hard when he crossed the room toward her, some instinct screaming that more danger had just arrived, and it took a long moment of him kneeling slowly, hands visible, voice low, before recognition finally broke through the fear clouding her eyes. She whispered his name, Miho's name, and something in her voice cracked apart entirely once she said it. Relief and terror tangled together so completely she couldn't separate them anymore. He broke the chains around her wrists with careful hands, aware suddenly of how easily strength like his could hurt someone this fragile, if he wasn't paying attention. She didn't pull away from him. She collapsed forward instead, into him, shaking, and Lavvice, who had commanded armies and ended entire bloodlines without flinching, found himself completely unprepared for how to comfort a crying human girl. He settled for simply staying still and letting her hold on for as long as she needed. It took nearly an hour before she calmed down enough to speak clearly. She told him everything then, in pieces, about the app, about how it had started as something meant to help people and turned into something that trapped them instead, about how she'd known for months and stayed quiet out of fear, and about finally deleting it all the night before, choosing to accept whatever consequences came, rather than staying complicit any longer. She asked him, voice small, whether that made her a coward for waiting so long before doing something. Lavvice told her no. He said cowardice was staying quiet forever. She'd broken that silence the moment it mattered most, even knowing exactly what it would cost her. Something about the moment, about her raw honesty laid bare in front of him, made the next question feel unavoidable rather than dangerous. She asked him, quietly, why he'd changed so completely since the start of the school year. Why he moved like someone who'd fought real battles before. Why sometimes, in unguarded moments, his eyes seemed to hold something far older than any teenager should carry. He could have deflected. Centuries of instinct told him secrecy was survival, that trust given carelessly had a way of turning into a blade eventually. He told her the truth instead. He explained it plainly, without embellishment, the way he might have once delivered a battlefield report. He wasn't Miho. He hadn't been Miho since the morning he woke up in this body, with no memory of ever being anyone else. He was a demon prince, exiled from his own world for a crime that wasn't truly a crime at all, trapped inside a human body as punishment, forbidden from ever fully reclaiming the power that used to define him. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, waiting for the fear he expected. The horror of learning her friend had been replaced entirely by something else wearing his face. It didn't come. She sat with the information for a long moment, processing it with the same steady focus she brought to everything else, and then asked, quietly, What had happened to the real Miho? Lavvice admitted he didn't fully know. The exile ritual had placed him inside this body without explaining what became of its original occupant, whether Miho's consciousness still existed somewhere beneath his own, dormant, or whether the transfer had simply erased him entirely to make room. It was a question that had haunted him since his first morning here, one he hadn't found the courage to investigate too deeply. Shiion reached out and took his hand then, human and small against his, and told him that whoever he really was underneath, the person who'd protected her, who'd broken her free of that chair, felt real enough to matter regardless of what name belonged to the body carrying him. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something steadier than that, acceptance, offered without hesitation, from someone who had every reason to be terrified and chose trust instead. Street, listening quietly through the earpiece the entire time, finally spoke up once the heaviest part of the conversation passed. She said, somewhat awkwardly, that since the secret was already out, she might as well fill in the rest of it properly, the parts even Lavvice himself didn't fully understand. She explained the exile system in more detail than anyone had bothered giving him back in the Obsidian Court. Every exiled demon received a restriction stone during transfer, a seal designed to lock their power away almost completely, permanently, regardless of circumstance. What Lavvice carried instead was different. A bloodstone, rarer and far more dangerous to implant, allowed fragments of power to surface under specific conditions: violence, corruption, concentrated darkness, precisely the pattern he'd been experiencing since his first day in this body. She admitted that whoever had implanted it in his holding cell had taken an enormous risk. If the Demon King's court ever discovered the substitution, it wouldn't just endanger Lavvice, it would destroy whoever had helped him too. Shiion asked, carefully, whether that meant his power would keep growing the longer he stayed exposed to things like Blue Bow and the corruption connected to it. Street confirmed it, though she added a warning alongside the confirmation. Growth like that came with a cost. Every surge pulled from concentrated darkness left residue behind, and residue accumulated. Eventually, if he kept drawing on corrupted sources rather than his own natural power, something would have to give. She didn't know exactly what. Nobody in the Lesser Demon Network had documented a bloodstone case quite like his before. Lavvice absorbed all of it without visible reaction, filing the information away the same methodical way he processed everything dangerous. He'd survive worse uncertainty than this. He'd survived exile itself. What mattered more, in that moment, was the trail Young Moo's organization had left behind, and the names beginning to surface in Street's ongoing investigation that reached far beyond a single drug operation running out of a few warehouses. Two names in particular kept appearing in intercepted communications over the following days: Mina and Han Yanju, names Street had never encountered before in any context connected to the Hilt Clan or to Young Moo directly, yet somehow tangled into the same web regardless. Street explained, piecing together fragments from multiple sources, that Han Yanju appeared to run an organization entirely separate from Young Moo's drug network, older, better hidden, with resources that suggested backing far beyond ordinary human criminal enterprise. A third name, Han Su, surfaced alongside her occasionally, though his exact role remained unclear even to the lesser demons trying to track the connection. What worried Street most wasn't the mystery itself. It was a single intercepted phrase, overheard by one of her contacts during a conversation she wasn't supposed to have access to at all. Someone had mentioned, in passing, that the flowers were finally blooming again after such a long wait. Devouring flowers, thought extinct for centuries, blooming again, spoken about with the casual satisfaction of someone watching a long investment finally pay off. Lavvice recognized immediately that Blue Bow, the warehouses, Young Moo, Jingi, all of it, might only be the visible surface of something considerably larger and older, something that had been patiently building itself back up long before he'd ever set foot in this world. He thought about his father's court, about the confident declaration that the Hilt Clan's darkest research had been fully eradicated centuries ago. He thought about how wrong that declaration now appeared to be. That night, back in Miho's small bedroom, Shiion's blood still faintly visible on his knuckles despite washing them twice, Lavvice sat by the window and looked out at a city that had no idea how much danger was quietly accumulating beneath its ordinary streets. Street's voice came through the earpiece one final time before he finally allowed himself to rest. She told him, in her characteristically dry tone, that if he intended to keep pulling on threads this large, He was going to need considerably more allies than one lesser demon and one traumatized human girl. Lavvice didn't disagree. He'd faced armies before with better odds than this. But he'd also learned something important since waking up in this fragile, borrowed body, something the Obsidian Court's marble halls had never taught him. Strength wasn't only measured in raw power. Sometimes it was measured in a girl choosing to delete everything she'd built rather than stay complicit. Sometimes it was measured in an uncle who couldn't speak against a verdict but refused to stop believing anyway. Sometimes it was measured in a demon with no name finally getting one and deciding that name was worth being loyal to. He closed his eyes, exhaustion from the day finally catching up to him, and let himself drift towards sleep with one thought settling clearly above all the others. Whatever Han Yanju was building, whatever those blooming flowers actually meant for both worlds, he intended to be standing in front of it when it finally showed itself completely. 3 days passed before the city gave him another piece of the puzzle, and it came from a direction Lavvice hadn't expected at all. Lavvice Vindica reached him. It happened through the same stray animal channel Street had once used, except this time the creature that appeared on his windowsill was a crow instead of a cat, sitting with an unnatural stillness that told Lavvice immediately this wasn't an ordinary bird. His uncle's voice came through it, quieter than Lavvice remembered, careful in the way of someone who understood exactly how much trouble this conversation could cause if the wrong person ever learned about it. Varkin didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told Lavvice that whispers had reached the demon realm's outer court, fragments of information about corrupted energy readings spiking in the human world, readings large enough that even distracted nobles who usually ignored exile cases had started asking questions. He warned that if the court connected those readings back to Lavvice specifically, the consequences would extend beyond exile into something considerably more permanent. Lavvice asked whether his uncle had learned anything about Han Yanju. The pause on the other end lasted long enough that Lavvice almost thought the connection had failed. Then Varkin admitted, reluctantly, that the name carried weight in certain old circles, circles that predated the Hilt Clan's fall, circles that had gone quiet for so long most of the current court assumed they no longer existed at all. He said Han Yanju wasn't simply connected to the Hilt Clan's remnants. She might be the reason those remnants survived his extermination in the first place. Lavvice felt something settle cold and heavy in his chest at that, a fury edged sharper by the possibility that his single greatest act of justice, the one that had cost him everything, might have been incomplete from the very beginning. Varkin offered one final piece before the crow's borrowed shape began trembling, signaling the connection was reaching its limit. He said Mina, the second name surfacing in Street's investigation, wasn't a lieutenant or subordinate the way Jingi served young Mu. She appeared to operate as something closer to an equal, someone Han Yanju trusted enough to move independently, which made her considerably more dangerous than a simple errand runner. The crow's eyes flickered once, then went dull and ordinary, an animal again instead of a vessel, and hopped off the windowsill without any further sign it had ever been anything more. Lavvice sat with that information for a long time afterward, turning it over the way he once analyzed enemy troop movements before a battle. Everything he'd uncovered since arriving in this world, the bullying, the tattoos, Blue Bow, young Mu, all of it now looked less like separate problems and more like branches extending from a single root buried somewhere far deeper than he'd initially assumed. He brought Street and Shiion together the following evening. The three of them gathered in the small kitchen of Miho's apartment, while his mother worked her second shift and his sister slept down the hall, laying out everything he now understood in the same measured, methodical tone he once used briefing commanders before a campaign. Street confirmed what Varkin had suggested, adding details her own network had finally managed to piece together over the following day. Han Yanju's organization operated almost entirely in shadow, its resources far exceeding anything a simple criminal enterprise should possess, and multiple lesser demons who'd tried investigating it directly over the years had simply stopped reporting afterward, their fates never confirmed. Shiion, quieter than usual since the previous night's ordeal but steadier than Lavvice expected given everything she'd survived, asked the question that mattered most. She asked what they were actually planning to do about an enemy this large, given that Lavvice still couldn't legally kill a human, still couldn't fully access his own power without corrupted sources feeding it, and still technically remained a fugitive from his own world on top of everything else. Lavvice didn't have a complete answer for her. He told her honestly that the plan, for now, was simply to keep pulling every thread they found until the full shape of the thing finally became visible enough to fight properly. It wasn't a satisfying answer, but it was an honest one, and honesty seemed to matter more to both of them than false confidence would have. That same night, in a location none of them yet knew existed, deep within a converted shipping facility on the far side of the city, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes reviewed a series of reports laid across a steel table. Photographs of the warehouse Lavvice had destroyed, security footage from the tattoo parlor, grainy but clear enough to show a teenage boy dismantling 6 enhanced men without visible effort. A medical report detailing young Mu's injuries, more severe than he'd admitted to anyone outside his inner circle. This was Mina, though nobody watching would have guessed her exact role from her calm, unhurried demeanor. She studied the footage a second time, expression unreadable, before finally speaking to someone standing just outside the frame of available light. She said the exile hadn't gone the way anyone in the old circles originally expected. She said whatever power lived inside that human body now, it was growing faster than their projections had accounted for, and growing faster meant their timeline would need adjusting. A second voice answered from the shadows, feminine, older, carrying an authority that made even Mina's confident posture straighten slightly out of old habit. Han Yanju told her, calmly, that adjustment wasn't necessarily unwelcome. She said centuries of patient cultivation had taught her that the strongest flowers always bloomed from soil richest in conflict, and that a demon prince unknowingly fertilizing their return might prove more valuable alive and unaware than dead and forgotten. She instructed Mina to keep watching, not to interfere yet, simply to observe how far this particular flower intended to grow before deciding whether it needed pruning or harvesting entirely. Mina asked what should happen if Lavvice uncovered too much before that decision was made. Han Yanju's answer carried no hesitation at all. She said every garden required occasional pests to be dealt with directly when the moment demanded it, and that she trusted Mina to recognize that moment when it finally arrived. Back across the city, unaware of the conversation unfolding about him in a hidden facility he hadn't even learned existed yet, Lavvice finally allowed himself a few hours of uneasy sleep. Shiion safely returned to her own apartment, under Street's careful watch, tomorrow already promising more questions than answers. He didn't know yet that Mina had been quietly watching him for longer than he suspected, present at both warehouses without ever revealing herself, cataloging every flicker of power he displayed with the same clinical patience Han Yanju had spent centuries perfecting. He didn't know that the flowers Han Yanju spoke of weren't simply a weapon or a drug ingredient, but something closer to a long, patient harvest, one that had been quietly cultivating conflict and corruption, specifically because conflict and corruption made them grow stronger. And he didn't yet understand that his own exile, the punishment meant to strip him of everything he once was, might have placed him directly at the center of exactly the kind of soil Han Yanju had spent centuries waiting to find. Somewhere above both worlds, in the cold marble halls of the Obsidian Court, whispers about unusual energy readings continued spreading among nobles, who still believed a broken exile posed no real threat to anyone. They had no idea what was quietly taking root beneath their feet.